Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Sound Off Ladies. Today we have a very special guest with us. Her name is Rebecca Alexandar. She's here. Can you wave, Rebecca? Everyone says hello. She is amazing. There are so many things that she has done that I could mention on. She is a psychotherapist. She's an author. She wrote a book called Not Fade Away. Just recently, they're thinking about making it into a movie for Hollywood, so we can't wait to see it in the theater sometime soon. She's also an extreme athlete, very fit. She's a fitness instructor. She climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Just thinking about it just makes me a little bit nauseous, but wow. And on top of that, she swam from the Alcatraz prison in San Francisco Bay to the shore to raise money for UCSF, the Department of Ophthalmology. So we are so honored to have you here with us today. We have several questions for you, and we only have a limited amount of time, so we'll try to control ourselves. Okay. We have to mention a few more things, right? We do follow you on Instagram. We see lots of pictures of your dog. Your dog's real name is Ollie, but you tend to call him Monkey, right? Oh, that's a cute dog there on Instagram. So welcome, Rebecca. So we're going to start with an area that's obviously something you care about, which would be sports. Liz, would you like to ask the first question? Hi, Rebecca. It's nice to meet you. I'm so glad you came. I saw an amazing, awesome adventure. You're a climber, a swimmer, a soccer player, right? I cannot name all the things you are involved in. You have just so much passion related to fitness. How did you get involved in fitness and extreme sports? Just how did it start? What challenges did you encounter? It's just absolutely amazing what you do.
So thank you for all of you for having me here tonight. I'm so happy and I'm so honored to be here because I really admire all of you. I told you all that I have trouble sometimes trying to sign and like do the ASL and English at the same time. So I'm just gonna talk and not sign for everybody's benefit. Anyway, so thank you for having me. Liz, your question is great. And I've always just loved being competitive. I've loved, soccer and just sports in general, but I grew up with brothers. And so if I didn't like sports, I probably would always have to just play alone. So I knew that I needed to be involved in order to be included. But more importantly, I was in an accident when I was about 18 years old. It was after high school and it was from drinking, and it's another story, but it's in my book. So if you want to read it, I welcome you to do that. But I was in an accident and I really broke so many bones in my body that I had to relearn how to walk and I had to recuperate. I was in a wheelchair for 4 months and it was a really long, laborious process to be able to, It was a really long, laborious process to be able to recover from that. And in my physical therapy, I realized that I was gonna have to be physically fit and really continue to work on fitness and being in shape because it was the only way I was going to be able to support all of the injuries I sustained in that accident. So I had the accident and recovered and really started to understand the mind-body connection and feeling so much stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. And then later, when I was diagnosed with Usher syndrome, the more vision I lost and hearing I lost, I just realized that I didn't have control over what was happening to me, but I did have control over how I took care of my body. I did have control over what I could do. And I think that being physically strong makes me feel so empowered. It makes me focus on what I have and not what I don't have. And it's just been this wonderful part of my life to help me, you know, just manage stress and anxiety and just everything that, you know, comes with being human. So I've always just really loved the way it makes me feel, both emotionally and physically.
That makes me feel good, strong and physically fit. That's truly amazing.
Yep.
So do you teach fitness classes?
Yes. So, well, now we're living in COVID. So there's not a lot that's, I'm not teaching now. And really, when I started traveling so much for my book, for the book tour, I wasn't able to teach as often as I wanted to. But, oh, I need to move my...
Can we hold on just a second, please? So she's signing and talking at the same time. Do you want me to sign the whole time? Okay. Okay. That's easier. Okay. Better? Okay, keep going. Sorry.
Okay. Okay.
You're talking about fitness, being an instructor.
So now, what I've started to do now is I've started teaching all of these like different fitness instructors about accessibility. And there's, people think that if you enjoy fitness and you want to be in shape, that you have to be fully able-bodied. It means that you can walk and you have all four limbs, and that we don't think about people who may want to be physically active or physically fit, not just because they want to look good and be in shape, but because it's how they take care of their mental health as well as their physical health. But they may also have, different needs or different abilities. So how do we create access with the programs that we have to be able to give them the opportunity to be in shape and to feel just as strong and empowered as so many people who are fully able-bodied? So I really try to encourage fitness instructors, and I now teach fitness instructors how to make their classes accessible and inclusive, so that no matter what your needs are or your abilities are, you can modify the class to the best of your ability.
That is amazing. That's wonderful. I have some questions for you about your career as a psychotherapist, right? And physical fitness and mental health. Obviously, this is all part of your practice. So access to mental health has never been easy for members of the deaf community. So I have two questions for you. What are the biggest challenges for the deaf and hard of hearing community in regards to issues that need to be addressed often? And then that's the first question. Go ahead.
Okay, so what are the most common issues? One of the things, access has always been the biggest issue. It's always been the hardest to navigate, finding the right type of provider for someone who is deaf. Because first we're looking for, hopefully we want to have a deaf or fluent in ASL therapist. And if we don't have a therapist who is fluent in ASL or who is deaf themselves, then we have to find a hearing therapist. And with the hearing therapist, we have to have an interpreter. So as anybody can imagine, whatever your, most personal issues are, having to share that with a stranger first is very difficult and not probably your first choice of how you would, share your problems. But then to have an interpreter in there who has to interpret from you to a hearing therapist what you're communicating, there's a fear that your needs and what you're trying to communicate is not being communicated directly from you. And also, and more importantly, the deaf community, or being raised as a deaf person, living in this time and day, even today that we live in, being deaf or hard of hearing is not an experience that I think hearing people will necessarily understand. There's a whole culture, as all of us know, to being deaf. There are cultural norms, there are common, things that happen in the deaf community. There's so much that the same way we talk about, various things like race and gender identity and sexual orientation, the deaf community itself has its own very rich and vibrant culture. And so I think sometimes deaf people who are looking for a therapist end up having to see a therapist who's hearing with an interpreter, and then they end up spending much of the time having to educate their hearing therapist about the norms of their community, about what it means to be deaf. And so it takes away from their experience to just be present, to just say, this is what's going on for me. There's so many moving parts. So that's definitely one piece of it. And another piece is that because the number of therapists who are either fluent in sign and the access to the types of therapists we're looking for, remember, there are all different types of therapy. There's drug addiction, there's substance abuse, there's cognitive behavioral therapy, there's dialectical behavioral therapy, there's psychodynamic psychotherapy. There are all different forms of therapy for all different types of issues, and some are better for other issues than just seeing a regular run-of-the-mill therapist. But the access may be more limited to the specific therapist who would be best for you based on the limitations of what types of therapists are available and who are able to either sign themselves or, be willing to have an interpreter there with you.
So when you talk about an individual who is deaf and seeking therapy, right, and they're using an interpreter, obviously the deaf person has to educate the therapist to make sure that the therapist understands the issues. Is therapy in that situation effective?
That's a good question, right? Because I think it can be very, very, frustrating for a deaf person to go into therapy hoping to find some, relief or comfort or understanding, and coming out feeling like they've had to spend most of the time educating the therapist, first and foremost, about their, the community they come from or the family they were raised in, and what it's like, for instance, if it's a deaf person raised in a hearing family. And they were, for most of their lives, really sort of encouraged and almost forced to be a hearing person when really they were deaf, and how that affected their identity. So there's so many different factors that come into play. So it's a really good question. And for that reason, my first choice is always to find a deaf or an ASL, signing therapist, because I think that is a big part of the problem when you see a hearing therapist that has no experience with the deaf community.
I have a second question. With telehealth, there are many therapy sessions then that are happening through video, or in other situations, right, where they're required to use video. So now a deaf person has to use video relay service, right? So we're using a variety of interpreters, and that is an additional layer of complexity. So how do we deal with that as a community? Right now, right, in person, right, you tend to have the same interpreter that comes to your appointments, but that's the way the situation has been for now. So now that we're using telehealth, how does that work?
Well, it's interesting because I think sometimes, for example, I have a patient who went into treatment and he had an interpreter. The interpreter got sick. And so he really needed to continue going to this treatment program, but he couldn't. He had to stop. Why? Because they needed to find a new interpreter. And so that was, something he was available. He was able to be online, but he needed to find an interpreter who was available. And right now right. So so that's one issue. But, I think that what I have found is that a lot of deaf people actually spend so much time FaceTiming and on video that for some deaf people, they've actually found it that they like it more. They like being on video more than having to travel to see a therapist. Some of them prefer it because they're used to it, just because they're so used to having the video relay system. And lastly, I think that one of the issues that deaf people often find is that if they find a therapist, and if this is a therapist they found from another deaf friend, that maybe they know other people who are seeing this therapist. So they're scared they're going to see someone they know in the waiting room. They're worried about their confidentiality. So now when we're doing virtual sessions, for some people, deaf people, they prefer it because they don't have to worry about being in a waiting room and potentially running into someone they know because they're both seeing the same signing therapist. So there are some benefits to it.
So I'm going to jump in. This is Marley. Marley's going to ask you a question too, okay, Rebecca? So this is Marley. I would like to follow up with just your recent sentence in regards to deaf people depending on sign language interpreters through video relay service and experiencing a variety of interpreters, especially with therapy, right? And the interpreters have different personalities, styles of signing. So as a deaf individual who needs therapy, and you're communicating through a third person, it has to be hard. Let's say, for example, in regards to mental health, the Federal Communications Commissions, the FCC, they decided that there's a specific number, 988, like where people could call if they have suicidal ideations, right? Like a hotline. Right? So anyone can call, right? And those individuals have already been trained. So now the FCC has chosen for people who are deaf who need to depend on interpreters that, right, they cannot call, right, directly to a hotline, right, for someone who is a professional and knows what to do and knows how to help. But they have to call through a video relay service and then call the hotline, which I think is horrible. I think it's discrimination because not all interpreters working in the VRS setting are trained to deal with all types of people, especially if they have mental health issues. And so that worries me. So what is your thoughts on that?
I think that's a really good point. I think one of the biggest problems we face discrimination anytime something new comes out for anyone, especially related to mental health. My immediate question is this accessible? Who can access this? And if they can't, or if it's not accessible, then what work? Immediately, my first thing is, what work do we need to do to make this accessible? And it makes me sad to say that. Obviously, it's the reality. And I think all of us on this video call are used to knowing that whatever it is that's offered to the general public, first and foremost, is usually going to be discriminatory in some way. It's very rare that it comes out and everyone is included and thought about for this process. Now, especially now during COVID, the incidence of substance use and of domestic violence has gone way up. And with the increase of domestic violence and substance use, there's an increase of suicidal ideation. There's an increase of a need to or want to, to not have to feel, to not have to be alive, right? So I think one of the biggest pieces of this is you're absolutely right. Interpreters are not trained to be mental health professionals. So even if they're interpreting, the information they're getting and the way that they are conveying that message, we all know that, people have always asked me, well, why are deaf people so expressive? They always seem so intense when they're signing. Because hearing people don't know that so much of our grammar and syntax revolves around the face. It's not necessarily that you're being so emotive or you're so dramatic. That's a part of your language. And so I think oftentimes, even with interpreters, let's say you have an interpreter who's a little bit more relaxed and their facial expressions are not as, or the way that they take information and convey it is not the same as the person who is relaying that information. There's a disconnect there, just like you said. So that's, go ahead.
This is Marley. So I don't want to bash or diminish the use of interpreters or their skill set, but really, right, a deaf person should be able to call a hotline directly, right, when they are available 24 hours a day, right? So we need to give deaf people options instead of going through a third-party video relay service. Again, this is not about the work of interpreters, but just direct access. We need to be able to have the same rights as everyone else. And so that's what we need. We need to get that approved. This is Alexis. So in regards to domestic violence right now, yes, there has been an increase. Marley saying domestic violence, drug usage, alcohol usage. With the pandemic that's going on, right, I am thinking to myself, if I was not sober, I would not be sitting here today. So I think of my friends who are trying to become sober, and what are they doing? I know that a couple of them are looking for rehab or for help, but they can't find any because of the interpreter situation. They can't find access or resources, but they need help. So you see, like, deaf and hard of hearing people, right? We have those issues within our community.
Right. So I think, and thank you for making that sort of interruption. I think what my point was that was taking me too long to get to was that it is not about the interpreters, but it's not fair for interpreters to have to be the ones sort of on the front lines of being in this position. This is something that really should be for someone who is fully trained, so that they have that direct access and communication, so that nothing is sort of lost. So thank you for making that interruption, because it was taking me very long to make a very simple point. But I will say that you're absolutely right. And, I was going to send someone with hearing loss who signed a little bit, but really focused on even being able to read lips at the beginning of COVID. First, we couldn't send him because of COVID. Second, we couldn't send him because of masks. And third, this was something where it sort of everyone on, I think, the in the deaf community, whether you're hard of hearing or you're deaf, with this sort of lack of access. There are limited facilities and places now that are being established and developed, but then remember, we're talking about actually being able to afford it too. So oftentimes, even being able to access rehab, there are state-funded programs, but if we don't even have programs for people who are deaf, then who is funding this? And being able to start A, to show that there is a real need for it, and B, get the funding, are two of the major issues I think we find in being able to set up real, community service programs and rehab facilities for people in the deaf community. And you're right, Marley, it is a big issue. And I have to tell you, when people reach out to me who are deaf and they tell me they have substance abuse issues, my immediate response is fear. And I'm not afraid to meet with them or to have a session with them. I'm afraid about trying to find them the help that they need and they deserve in a timely manner, so that this doesn't turn into something like, even if it's not a purposeful death because of their substance use. So it's a very good question, and it is still an issue that we're, addressing and facing today. And this is why I think we oftentimes find a higher incidence sometimes of substance abuse and domestic violence within the deaf community, not because the deaf community is any lesser, it's because they don't have the access that hearing people do. Yeah. It's a good question.
That's awful, Alexis says. Wendy agrees, and Liz says it's definitely important. So speaking about identity as a deaf individual, right, it's already hard, right? It's already a struggle. So Wendy, do you have some questions in regards to identity? I do. This is Wendy. Right, so as an individual is trying to discover their identity, a person with Usher's syndrome, when did you first identify yourself? As well as what were some of your struggles? And what would be their first step if they were very similar to you and struggling with their identity?
That's a good question, and I appreciate you asking, because I think that everybody has their own process of figuring out who they are, what their identity is. And for me, I was born into a hearing family with hearing, really. I had what they called it a cookie bite of hearing loss. And then later, because of Usher syndrome, I progressively lost my hearing. But I was wearing hearing aids in college, and I decided I wanted to take ASL because nobody knew what my trajectory was going to look like. When I was diagnosed with Usher syndrome type 3, what I had not yet been identified. So they said, yes, you have Usher syndrome, but we've never seen it as it presents itself in you. We don't know when you're going to lose your vision, when you're going to lose your hearing. We just know that you're losing both. And so I sort of felt paralyzed by that information. What do you do with that information? I was about 19 years old, and I was already feeling like I didn't quite fit in with my hearing friends. If they would go out to parties or they would go out to a really noisy, loud, dark place, first, I certainly couldn't hear, and I definitely couldn't see very well. So I felt very isolated. I didn't enjoy myself, and it didn't make me feel included and like I was having fun. It usually made me feel like something's wrong with me, or that like this is something I should be able to enjoy. Or I would end up just having to, drink and make an ass of myself because, it was a way for me to distract myself from feeling that lonely, from feeling like I don't belong here. And that didn't feel good either. It made me like wake up feeling super hungover and maybe like hooking up with guys I probably didn't want to hook up with because I was drunk. And that was my sort of coping mechanism, but it certainly wasn't helping me find my identity or build my confidence. And so I started learning sign language, and I became more assimilated into the deaf community. There was a fairly reasonable deaf community at the University of Michigan where I went to college. There was a there was a wonderful director of deaf and hard of hearing student services. Her name is Joni Smith. She's an interpreter. She's interpreted for, Bill Clinton and the Dalai Lama, but she was really a huge part of my process of learning how to advocate for myself, of understanding that when I went to class and I needed certain accommodations, these weren't things that I was asking for because I felt like they were privileges. They were rights. I had the rights to these things. And that was huge because I think oftentimes we don't want to bother people. We don't want them to have to adjust themselves or make any changes. We just want everybody to do what they're doing. So we don't want to be the problem. And she was the one who taught me that I wasn't being a problem. I was speaking my needs, and I was being able to create the accessibility that I needed to put me on a more level playing field as all of my hearing and sighted, friends and other students. So that was one piece. But the more I assimilated myself into the deaf community, the more ASL I learned, the more I found this true sense of, wow, so I'm not a hearing person and I'm not a deaf person, but I'm not those things either. And what I love about the deaf community and what I love about being deaf is there's a very honest, straightforward nature to the types of conversations I have with my deaf friends. There's a lack of pretense. There's a lack of bullshit that I find in the hearing world that oftentimes, particularly if you're a lip reader or you have hearing loss, or if you're deaf and you're trying to follow, sometimes just it gets confusing. And my friends in the deaf community, I always know what they're thinking, what they're feeling. Like, they do not bullshit me. And maybe it's just the friends I've made, but I have found that throughout my time of being a part of the deaf community, and it is my saving grace. It makes me feel like these are people who anything they're saying to me, they might say to somebody else, but they're certainly not, not saying anything to me they wouldn't, they're not telling other people anything they wouldn't tell me. So that was one piece. The honesty, the straightforward nature. There's so much humor with my deaf friends. And I think sometimes when we think of being deaf, or when we think about people who aren't like us, who have any form of what is perceived as a disability in mainstream society, we don't think of funny. We don't think of laughing. We sort of think of those people like somehow we're trained as a culture to feel sorry for them or pity or whatever. And I got to tell you, the most fun I've had and the most I've laughed has been with my friends who are either deaf, who have vision loss, or who have a disability, because there's no way to live in a world that we live in to constantly have to fight for your rights and not also have a wicked sense of humor. Otherwise, you would go absolutely insane, I think.
Marley's saying, no filter in the deaf community, right? The deaf community does not have a filter. Wendy says, definitely. Yeah. Sometimes it can be dangerous, Marley says. Alexis agrees. So, Wendy, the second part of your question is? Wendy says, what is your advice, or what would you like to share with the community and individuals who are struggling? What should be their first step? What should they do to embrace and begin embracing their identity? What would you suggest? What would be a gold nugget for them?
A good question. I think when we experience feelings that are uncomfortable, when we find ourselves not wanting to do certain things or interact with people in certain ways, the things that make us uncomfortable, that's the first place I want you to start. I want you to ask yourself, what about this makes me uncomfortable? Am I afraid to ask for what I need? Am I afraid to ask for help? I think one of the biggest issues we also see is that people feel like asking for help means that they are incapable, means that people will think that they're not smart or capable of taking care of themselves, that they're not independent. And the truth is, the best way to maintain your independence, the best way to be a part of kind of the community, is to be able to ask for help. We all need help. We all need help in order to live our lives every day, even if it's, dealing with, having to do the most basic of things in our lives. We all need to help each other, and we need to be able to ask for help. So that's one piece. But I really think that the best thing you can do is when you are confronted with an experience that makes you uncomfortable, instead of saying, I don't want to do that, that makes me really uncomfortable, ask yourself why it makes you uncomfortable. And if it's because you're afraid to ask for something to have your needs met, then that's another important question. Okay, well, what am I afraid of? And so I think it's always best to start. For me, I was afraid to learn ASL and then become more ingrained in the deaf community because I thought people would always see me as a hearing person, and they would always think that I was a fake or that I wasn't, really a deaf person. And I'm somewhere in between, right? There's nothing I love more than not having my cochlear implants on. There's no bigger gift I have been given than the gift of deafness. And I told you guys all before that my deafness is, in some ways, it's my religion. And but it took a lot of discomfort to get to that place and to accept that this is a part of me that I now absolutely love. But I didn't start there. It was a process. So I think we have to start developing comfort with being uncomfortable, because that's where we have the opportunity to grow. And the second thing I'll say is that people need to really start also working on holding themselves accountable. I think it's very easy for us to blame everyone else for why we're in a certain position. And there may be a lot of people at fault for why we are in the position we're in, but the only way we're going to change the place that we're in, if it's not a place we want to be, is by holding ourselves accountable for what we can do to change that, and not just blame everybody else for keeping us where we are, if that makes sense.
Marley says, can I quickly say something? I want to touch upon that. Is that okay, Alexis? Sure. Rebecca says, sure. So as a therapist, so this is your book, right? I'm fascinated by the concept that you talked about women in prison. So maybe, I don't know, teaching something, or you noticed that they weren't interested in listening to you until you had a conversation with a couple of prisoners and you actually heard them out. And they were talking about their home life. They were talking about domestic violence, their particular situation, their children, their family. And then actually when you started listening, you then were able to communicate with those women and finally figured out that you listened to them. And that's what they needed. So that's when you realized that I should become a therapist. Is that correct?
There's so many reasons why I realized I should become a therapist. That was definitely a part of it. I realized just how important it is to listen, to be able to let people share their stories. And I know that coming to terms with having a condition that causes you to go deaf and blind means you need a lot of therapy yourself. So, I have been through a lot of therapy myself to help myself. And I've had so many experiences that have sort of led me in the direction of really feeling passionate about the human condition, really feeling very curious about the human condition, and certainly working for the prison system and going and trying to teach these women and thinking that I had any idea what it was they needed to learn. I had a whole curriculum, and when I went there and I realized that all these women needed me to do was to listen to their stories, was to have someone see them and really be able to be present with them. That was all they needed. I was a white girl who was 20 years old. There was not a whole lot I was going to be able to do to change their lives, except to let them know that I heard them, that I saw them.
Wow, Alexa says. So those are all good things, right? But all good things must come to an end. So we're going to wrap up this conversation. So do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share with us before we wrap up?
I have so many thoughts. I'm so grateful for this space and this time, and for you guys letting me be nervous enough to not be able to sign and speak at the same time and accept me for that, because that has always been one of my longest ongoing insecurities. So I appreciate that. And I think that this platform that you have is incredible. It's amazing to be on a call like this with women that you're asking me these questions, and now I want to turn around and ask all of you questions because I feel like I have so much to learn from you. So I really, really am touched that you invited me. And now I wish I had my own video log so that I could be able to ask you guys all of these important questions.
That's a good idea. Marley says you can. Liz says, why not? Go ahead. You could tape it. We could make that part 2.
I think that's an awesome idea. Who's interviewing you guys?
Marley says, yay. Liz says, come on. Come on.
Thank you, all of you, for inviting me and giving me this space. And I really would love to have an opportunity to interview you guys and ask you so many of these questions because they're so important. And
Marley says that's fine. You can.
We learn so much from each other.
Feel free, Liz says.
Can I ask you right now?
Alexa says, I do think it's important. You want to ask us one question? Oh, the answers would be short. We only have 20 seconds left.
Okay. But maybe we can do it again sometime soon.
Liz says, sure. Yeah, we'll have to schedule another meeting, Alexa says. Great idea, Liz says. The point of our time together is that the community is missing this type of discussion, dialogue as we talk about issues, right? We don't have access to people listening, right, to broadcast, right? So in regards to resources that are available to us, we don't know. So the point of this is to conversate, to ask questions. That's very important, right? And that's not always available to us. So we will make plans for sure for you to question us. Thank you so much again, Rebecca, for being with us today and sharing your beautiful thoughts, your stories, sharing your personal experiences, which we haven't even got into yet. We look forward to seeing the movie soon. Buy the book, everyone, Marley says. Buy the book. It is a must buy, Alexa says. Bye. Take care. Bye. We'd like to say thank you to Rachel for interpreting tonight. Thank you so much.